Alright guys, we talked about the Enlightenment yesterday. And the Enlightenment is this idea of different ways of thinking on government. And you can see the Enlightenment ideas from like Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire are going to cause revolutions that will reshape the world, starting with the United States and going over to France. And there are a lot of interconnected ideas, like the French and Indian War here is going to leave not only France in financial trouble, but England as well. And that is going to inspire our first revolution, which is the American Revolution. Now this is going to be quick. This is a review. I'm sure you guys have done this in middle school and elementary school 100 times, but just to make sure, it's what we're going to do, and you're going to take a little tour with Team Melega here. So, during the 17 and 1800s, European monarchs, as we've been studying, have gone out on this quest to find new sources of money, like the Spanish gold and silver from Mexico and Peru. And for the British, it is the lumber and the tobacco and the cotton that they're taking from North America. And one of the reasons why they wanted this money was that a large amount of money was spent on fighting different wars, especially the French and Indian War, which was started by George Washington, literally happened right very near my grandparents' backyard. Spent a lot of time trying to find a belt buckle, a bayonet, anything, never found anything. But anyway, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, lasts from 1756 to 1763. And another reason for this was the desire for European monarchs to become absolute, like the unit we just talked about with Louis XIV and Peter the Great. In pursuing absolutism in their own countries, they destabilized not only their countries, but their colonies over in the Americas. So between 1775 and 1825, we'll go a 50-year period here, several revolutions are going to occur throughout the European colonies overseas. And as a result, North and South America are going to reshape the political landscape of the world. We're going to start here in Boston at the old State House Museum, the site of the Boston Massacre. Now, as the French and Indian War ends in 1763, tensions between the colonies in America and the mother country England become very visible. Right? The war drains the treasury of King George III. And his parliament felt that they didn't want to pay any more taxes. And we blew all of this money defending the English colonies from the French, so maybe they should pay for it. After all, we sent troops over there to protect them. So Parliament and the King began to enforce long-forgotten trade laws as Parliament raised taxes on the colonies. King George didn't want to hear his own people complain, but across the sea, 3,000 miles away in the colonies, well, who really cares? Now, over in the American colonies, the 13 colonies, people began to get upset. They had worked very hard to become self-sufficient, and they felt the king never did very much to help them. Right? If their taxes were going to be raised, then they wanted representation in Parliament. Fine, if you want to raise our taxes, we're still Englishmen, and a lot of these guys were rich men. They could have afforded these taxes. Their big problem is you didn't ask us. And you get the big quote, no taxation without representation. So if you want to raise our taxes, send over Ben Franklin, send Thomas Jefferson, send George Washington, give them seats in Parliament so they can speak on behalf of the colonies and vote. But the king didn't do that. You're my subjects, you will do what I tell you. And so this whole thing, like the Stamp Acts and the tea tax, these are things that really make the American colonists angry. Then in 1770, we have the famous incident of the Boston Massacre. Now, a century was standing there, and people begin gathering, and they're throwing snowballs, and some of them probably had ice and rocks in them and insults. And the soldiers, some of the young soldiers, we don't know who, panics, and they fire onto civilians in the crowd, killing several, including a former slave, we believe, named Crispus Attucks. This will be a tremendous propaganda boost to the American colonists, and it become known as the Boston Massacre. And Paul Revere helps make it famous by doing little etchings and drawings throughout Boston. So in response, you guys can all see your classmate William here, Bethany and Hannah. In response, down at the Old South Meeting House, the colonists met. And they would meet with representatives of the king. Well, the Boston Tea Party is led by a rabble-rouser, American patriot, Samuel Adams, like the guy named for the beer company. And they dress as Mohawk Indians, and they sneak aboard the ships, and they throw literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of British tea into the ocean in protest. They leave here, they run past the site of the Boston Massacre, and they wind up here by the Boston Customs House block. And here is literally a container of the tea that they threw overboard. They threw it into the ocean, into the harbor as a protest. And so this right over here is exactly where the ship was. And every time I go, I always get a little tea bag and I throw some tea into the river, or into the harbor rather, and say Team America. And so from here, things are going to get more interesting. All right. The First Continental Congress is going to meet in 1774 to determine what are we going to do next. All right. Now, how are we going to handle this problem with Great Britain, the mother country? And here's where we get the guys, the founding fathers, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. They will sit around and they will discuss and debate the relationship of the colonies with their mother country, England. And they created the Continental Army. And the Congress will appoint George Washington to be the general of that army. In between, all of these famous events are taking place. Here is the Old North Church in Boston. Now it's kind of, there's big buildings growing around it, but at the time it was very visible. And so this is the place where Paul Revere looked at the lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea, if the British were going to make any attempt to move on the colonists who had been stacking weapons and ammunition in cities down the road, little towns known as Lexington and Concord. So Paul Revere goes out on his ride, one if by land, two if by sea. Here is one of the lanterns that they sung. This guy here is an awesome tour guide, and he's really handsome, and he's got a copy of my shirt. What a jerk. All right, so now Paul Revere gets all the attention from the famous poem, but there were other writers, William Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott. So here we are in front of the Paul Revere statue, just, by the Old North Church. But Paul Revere is actually going to get captured. He is going to get held up, and it is Samuel Prescott that will sound the alarm down the road. I'm going to wear a Minuteman t-shirt tomorrow, down the road to Concord. And so here we are in Buckman's Tavern, and this is where early in the morning, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, the militia was called out to try and hold off the British, who had traveled a little bit, across Boston Harbor and were marching down the road. And 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, some guys are falling asleep, some guys are getting ready to go home, they're farmers, and the call comes out that the British are coming. So this guy, Colonel John Parker, leads the militia out onto Lexington Green. 40, 50 guys getting ready to march up against one of the most powerful armies in the world. The most powerful army. Now, if the British went up against Team Melega, they surely would have turned around. But as the colonists are here, they meet British regulars, and we don't know who fired first. We don't know where it is. It could have been, John Hancock. It could have been Samuel Adams. who are meeting just up the road here. A shot is fired, and there is a brief gun battle where many American colonists are wounded and killed. One guy who lived in this house crawled away after being shot and dies on his front porch. Things have now gotten nasty. And the shot that is heard around the world, a lot of people say it happened here at Lexington. That is not quite true. It happens down the road in Concord. All right. And here's what happened. As they get to Concord, about 6 more miles away down the street, here they are, over in here, if you can see it, is where the colonist militias are. And this statue is right on the other side of a wooden bridge. And as the militia, here it is, as the militia goes across the bridge of the British Army, they start going up this hill, and there's where a New Hampshire colonel ordered his troops to fire on the British regulars. The British began shooting at them, so this New Hampshire militia colonel said return fire, where 2 British regulars are shot. Up until that point, the militia were still Englishmen. But when an officer orders direct fire, now we are 2 separate groups and the revolution is on. The British will have to turn around and march about 18 miles back, being hunted and shot at by the American militia all the way back. So round 1 is a victory. And so by June of 1775, the fighting against England had begun. And the Second Continental Congress is going to meet in Philadelphia. And early on, things go absolutely terrible. All right? The Continental Congress had little money and even fewer military supplies or abilities. And the colonists are going up against the most powerful professional army in the entire world, the British regulars. Now, the Battle of Bunker Hill is fought, where famous Boston doctor Joseph Warren comes out to help them defend the hill. His statue is right here. This is actually my birthday. And the problem is that with the success at hammering the British, marching back from Lexington and Concord, and while we lose this battle, we kill a lot of British soldiers. It kind of pumps up everyone's ambitions. We get a little cocky. And so, as members of the Second Continental Congress are all, pumped up for this, the Declaration of Independence will be issued. And John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, kind of get together and advise. And in July of 1776, after making many revisions and amendments, the Continental Congress ratifies, votes on the approval of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the document is one of the greatest in all of human history, and many ideas you can see are written down come exactly from John Locke, the life, the liberty, and the property guy. We talked about it. Thomas Jefferson will interweave those with American ideas for declaring independence from England. And the Declaration is considered, as I said, one of the greatest documents in human history. So going into the war real fast, England has many advantages. Number 1, they've got a large professional army. Number 2, they've got enormous resources to draw from. And third, many American colonists remain loyal to England. Not everybody wanted to rebel. So this isn't going to take very long. It's not going to be expensive. The army's going to go over. They're going to lay the beat down, all right? They're going to clap in your guys' speak, the American colonists, and things are going to be over very, very, very quickly. We'll teach those little punks over there a lesson. Well, the 13 colonies of the new United States have volunteer, what I call citizen soldiers. We had no real navy and no money or resources to fall back on. The only advantage is that the colonists were fighting on home turf. It was their home court. And large cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia will be occupied. The fighting will fall farther away, it's called Fabian tactics, into the countryside. And so during the early years, victory looked bleak and hopeless. And then on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, 1776, George Washington famously crosses the Delaware River, and the United States Army wins the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey. This begins to get morale growing again. After a few more losses, the Army will spend the horrible winter of 1777, 1778 at Valley Forge. But despite the horrible conditions, the Army gets trained by a Prussian guy named Baron the Manfred von Steuben, who will train the Army and get them ready. And so when spring comes, for the first time, the Continental Army is ready, and they stand up to the British. For the first time, they didn't run. They have the training to stand up to the British military veterans. And so victories at Saratoga emboldened not only the Americans, but allies the French. The French were still angry at losing the French and Indian War, and if they had a chance to get back at the British, they were going to jump on it. So the French recognized the existence of a new country. So we would not be a country today if it was not for France. Let's make that clear. So the French joined an alliance with the United States against their old enemy, Great Britain. With the French aid comes money, it comes supplies, it comes officers like the Marquis de Lafayette, like Admiral Rochambeau, and most importantly, it brings soldiers and supplies, and the number one thing the French bring is a navy. So many of you may have gone to Williamsburg or Busch Gardens up in Virginia. In 1771, the French fleet blockades Chesapeake Bay as General George Washington boxes in the British Lord Cornwallis in the Virginia city of Yorktown. And the surrender at Yorktown was an upset. It is just shocking. And it signals the collapse of the British war effort in the New World. Within 2 years, the British in 1783 will sign the Treaty of Paris, recognizing the existence of their former colonies as the United States of America. The American Revolutionary War ends up with the United States becoming an independent country. Now we're going to have some problems. The Articles of the Confederation. You guys are going to learn about this next year in civics and economics. The first government the United States tries is the Articles of the Confederation, a very, very weak document that said everybody can pretty much do their own thing, and so it just doesn't work well. And then in the blazing hot summer of 1787, that should be 1787, is that a 1 or a 7? I can't tell from my angle. The United States Constitution was being written at another constitutional convention in Philadelphia. And what the Constitution does is it frames out a strong federal government, like in Washington, like the President in Washington, D.C., the Congress, and the Supreme Court. And this federal government has the ability to flex and grow. The genius of what these guys did is they knew they couldn't see everything into the future, so they allow the powers to expand and grow. There's only been 27 changes to it. And what they do is they have a legislative system that is going to have two houses called a bicameral legislature. And you have an upper house called the Senate, in which every state has an equal vote, 2 votes. So there are 100 people in the United States Senate. And a lower house called the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, you get more votes based on the population of your state. So like California and New York get more representation than like Wyoming simply because they've got more people. But it takes both the House and the Senate to work together. So small states are protected to work together to pass a law. Now the leader of the United States is going to be the president, who would lead a federal republic. And these ideas come directly from ancient Greece and Rome, right? So the president's job will be to enforce the laws. It'll be, he is the chief executive, to execute, to carry out. It is the legislative branch, Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, to make the laws, and it is the job of the Supreme Court to interpret the laws. So you can see these are three branches, what Baron de Montesquieu had said. So President Washington will be the very first president, and he is going to rule by precedent, which means he was the first one. No one really knew what to do, so people follow his standards. He was asked to be a king, and he said, no, that's what we fought against. I just want to go home to Mount Vernon. So he sets the standard of, after 8 years, calling it quits. If you've heard the musical Hamilton, he says, I've got to teach the people how to say goodbye. Nobody should be in power for too long, right? He gets a cabinet, a group of unofficial advisors to help him make decisions. So in the end, we have these three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, to check and balance each other so no one group could take over. And the document, the Constitution, as I said, was strong and adaptable. It becomes what is known as a living document that could change and grow with the times. And it is directly inspired by men of the Enlightenment, like John Locke and the Baron de Montesquieu. And so the United States becomes a federal republic in September of 1789. This new government was a representative government run by an elected legislature. We vote people, congressmen, representatives, and senators into Congress. To vote, however, and while this is great, this is the freest government the world had seen in a long time, it is not perfect. At the time, to vote, a person had to be a free white man. Right? African Americans, Native Americans, and women were not able to vote. But at this point, it was the freest government the world had seen since the Roman Republic. All right, fell, in the early years BC. Also written at the same time is what's known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And it spells out the basic rights and freedoms of the people, such as the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and many other ideas that can be traced right back to John Locke and the Enlightenment. And so what the American Revolution does is it starts off this wave of revolution. It's going to reverberate and go across the Atlantic next to the French Revolution, one of the most violent and complicated revolutions, but important revolutions in all of world history. We will begin to look at it tomorrow. It's going to take us a couple days because it is so intense. All right, guys, that's your American Revolution review. Hope you guys are doing well, and we'll talk to you soon.